and audio. So we are live. Hello.
Does your volume need to go down?
My apologies.
I do
just
not.
needed to, yeah.
Great.
Forgot about see that on the camera, so.
This is it. Yeah.
We're live but not started, I guess. We
We're
haven't hit a
live
quorum
but
yet.
not started,
Don't yet
yes.
have a quorum.
And we do have a member in the attendee area or a member of the public in the attendee area. So we are waiting for one more member for a quorum.
My understanding is Marquez is not available to join, and then Ms. Fugazi.
That's not- So
So
we're waiting
really
for
just for Marquez. She did confirm that.
yes.
Is Annie joining us?
Would you like to perhaps mute ourselves until we do the quorum?
Please, yes.
Good.
We're gonna go ahead and go on mute until we achieve a quorum.
Oh, the quorum problem, right?
We have a quorum.
Oh, that is weird. What do I need to be in conference?
Yes.
Good afternoon. Today is Wednesday, March 5th, 2025, and the time is 3:07 PM. I am calling to order the executive committee meeting for this date. We are located at 1999 Harrison Street, Suite 2300 in Oakland. And there are also two remote locations. One is at Hayward City Hall, 777 B Street, Hayward, California, 94541, and Balch Enterprise Incorporated, 30960.
Hey, Jack. Sorry, I was running a little late there.
We're, sorry. Can you hear us, Roche?
Okay.
I'm not sure Member Roche can hear us. Can you hear us?
Member Roche, can you hear them? Can you hear me? Julie, can you hear us? I do not believe she can, Chair.
Okay, we're just gonna pause to deal with this technical issue and then we'll come back to our introduction.
Julie, can you hear us?
Make a quick call. Are you able to hear us? It doesn't have, we're speaking and it seems like it can't, so just wanted to connect.
Can you guys hear me?
Yes.
Oh, I can hear you now.
Okay,
Oh, perfect.
great. Okay, wonderful. I'm
Sorry, I was having technical
Okay.
difficulties.
We're glad you're here with us and glad we're all connected now. So I had started the meeting and I was doing the announcement of the remote locations. And I believe I had just finished announcing the second remote location at Balch Enterprise Incorporated at 3960 Huntwood Avenue, Hayward, California, 94544. As both remote locations are provided in the agenda. Members of the public wishing to make a comment can do so either by using the raise hand function in Zoom or *9 if you're joining through telephone. And those comments will be called for throughout the public comment and public forum time slots. Clerk, could you please take the roll call?
Yes, thank you. Member Marquez. Member Roche. Oh, excuse me. Member Fugazi.
Present. Mhm.
Member Balch.
Present.
Vice Chair Gonzalez.
Present.
Chair Anderson.
Present.
We have a quorum.
Okay, quorum has been established, so we are going to proceed to our agenda. Our first agenda item was the welcome roll call. We have done that. The second agenda item is public comment. This item is reserved for persons wishing to address the executive committee on any AVA community energy related matters that are not otherwise on this meeting agenda. Public comments on matters listed on the agenda shall be heard at that time the matter is called. With all public comment, members of the public who wish to address the committee are customarily limited to 3 minutes per speaker and must complete an electronic speaker slip. I may increase or decrease the time allotted to each speaker depending on how many we have. And I'm looking at the clerk to see if we have any speakers at this time for kind of the general public comment, public forum.
There are no hands raised at this time.
Okay, I'm going to go ahead and close the public comment, agenda item number 2. Moving on to agenda item number 3, which is the approval of the minutes from February 5th, 2025. Clerk, are you aware of any
Yeah.
corrections to the minutes?
Yes, I am. There's a typo in for item 7, approval of minutes. I would need to correct that. Let me just go to my notes. It should read that Member Gonzalez Member Gonzalez brought the motion to approve the minutes and Member Marquez seconded the motion. That would need to be corrected. So I had copied the nomination language. So that would be corrected in the,
It was in there twice, doubly nominated.
Yeah,
Great, okay, so that will be corrected. Do we have any questions or comments from this body? Okay, seeing none, do we have any public comments on the minutes from February 5th, 2025?
there are no hands raised at this time.
Okay, public comment is closed on agenda item number 3. May I have a motion to approve the minutes?
So moved as amended.
Thank you. May I have a second?
Second,
Okay, moved by Vice Chair Gonzalez, seconded by Member Roche. May we have a roll call vote, please?
Thank you. Member Marquez. Member Roche.
yes.
Member Fugazi. Member Balch.
Aye.
Vice Chair Gonzalez.
Yes.
Chair Anderson.
Aye.
Minutes are approved.
Okay, moving on to agenda item number 4. This is a familiar topic. We talked about it, I think, at our last all board meeting. It's a critical municipal facilities update. This is an informational item. I believe staff is seeking input from this body. And we are, at this point, turning it over to our, oh no,
JP,
we're
yeah,
turning it
JP
over to
Ross.
JP. Okay, JP Ross, thank you so much.
Thank you very much. JP Ross, Vice President of Local Development, and we'll be presenting an update, as mentioned, on our critical municipal facilities portfolio work. We can go to the next slide, please, Adrian. So as mentioned, we did present this at the last board meeting as to the juncture at which we find ourselves with our critical municipal facilities portfolio to develop solar and storage projects on city facilities to increase resilience and provide some bill savings to our cities. This slide is the summary slide from the previous presentation. So we're at a very critical point in this program right now because we do have a deadline for NEM 2.0 approaching in April of 2026, which provides for some beneficial cost savings if we can get these projects installed and inspected within the next 14 months. So we're having to pivot pretty quickly right now, considering the vendor who we had been working with, PPA counterparty Greenbridge, has paused work on this process. So we're having to make some quick decisions, and some of those are really around the size of the portfolio and willingness of AVA to take on some additional ownership risk with respect to developing these projects, and what that means as far as our procurement process, how we can procure the services to get these systems installed, and what risks that potentially brings to AVA if we're owning these assets as opposed to bringing in a counterparty to do that. So that's a lot of the work that we've been doing over the last couple weeks since we presented to the board. So I wanted to give the executive committee an update on those activities. So we can go to the next slide, please. So some of the activities that we've been doing, first was to reach out to city staff. Prior to last board meeting, we had let staff who've been participating and working with us know that the program and the process was hitting some speed bumps based on a lot of the federal activity. So since then, we've reached out to staff and discussed the possibility of reducing this portfolio to a smaller number of projects that we have, so we have a higher degree of confidence in being able to deliver at least some projects to our cities. And there has been an interest from staff, confirmed that with all 6 participating cities. We proposed which projects we think make the most sense for being able to install by April of 2026. That's an ongoing conversation with staff. Nobody is signing on the line yet right now. This is very much in flux, but there's an interest in getting some projects completed. So from a procurement perspective, because we had issued our previous solicitation for an asset owner, that was not a public works solicitation. That was a solicitation for an ownership counterparty. And so if we're gonna take on these ownership of these assets, that really means a rapid turn of a public works solicitation process. So we actually got that going yesterday. Last night, we issued a request for qualification. So we've been working with legal counsel to confirm kind of a public works compliant procurement strategy that allows us to expedite this process and contract with competent design build contractor who can take the designs that we've developed in this portfolio to completing a pricing exercise and then permitting and construction of those projects. So we issued that RFQ last night. We're requesting responses on the 11th, and we'll quickly confirm a list of kind of our priority contractors who are the top contractors according to that RFQ, and then we can issue a subsequent request to proposals to that subset of vendors who we have deemed to be the most qualified to provide these services to them. So it allows us to issue that RFP to a subset of those vendors. And so that's really where I think the price and schedule is the rubber's gonna hit the road, right? We're gonna get responses and people are either gonna say, this is possible, based on their availability, their understanding of local permitting timeframes, their understanding of ability to secure equipment and complete installation, get inspection by April of 2026, or not, and also what's the pricing associated with that. So that's really, the importance of kind of getting this onto the street, so to speak, and getting feedback from the actual counterparties who would do this work for us in short order felt like the highest priority since we decided to kind of pivot to this approach. So that's some of the work that we've been doing on the procurement process. In tandem, in parallel to that, one of the key contractual questions is, what's the contract that AVA is going to use? AVA has many standard contracts. None of them are for this type of service because we haven't built projects of this nature before. And so we don't have a standard EPC contract, engineering, procurement, construction, or design build. It's another way to refer to it. So that's something that we're currently evaluating. We actually have a contract that one of our sister agencies, Peninsula Clean Energy, has signed for their municipal resilience program. And so that's a contract that we're evaluating for use. There are other kind of standard contracts that we can use, but we're trying to cut to the chase there because that will soon be the long pole in the tent. We'll need to issue that out, get EPC vendor feedback on their willingness to sign that contract. That's likely kind of one of the longer items in the contracting process is agreeing to those terms. So as sorry, next slide, please. So we have been doing some work on the portfolio. The previous portfolio that we had been looking at was about 21 projects and about 5 megawatts of solar. We're looking at a reduced portfolio, about 2 sites per city, and those sites have been identified as ones that don't have some of the longer lead, more customized equipment, which extends the procurement timeframe, and that our internal review kind of gives us the highest confidence of ability to install. There's also an element of what are the bill savings that those projects can deliver to the cities, since bill savings is also a key part of this procurement process. We are evaluating the cost impacts or the savings impacts of if we don't hit NEM 2.0 on these projects. That's something that we're going to have to figure out a scenario plan for. If we don't hit NEM 2.0, who's taking the risk? How is that risk shared amongst the parties? So it's also an important element of our site selection. And then we're going to be right now evaluating kind of the pricing that we have, because we do have some initial pricing from our previous counterparties, and starting to develop kind of an AVA PPA price that takes kind of the development, operation, asset management costs into account, as well as Ava's cost of capital, and these are some decisions we're gonna have to make going forward. And so, the portfolio now is about, 12 sites, 800 kilowatts of solar, so significantly reduced from the previous portfolio size. 2 megawatt hours of batteries, and then the construction costs in the $6 to $8 million range. So, and then there is federal tax credits that are still available. Those are at risk, pending some of the federal budgeting activities that we're seeing in Washington right now. And so, if we are able to get those tax credits, that's an additional $1.8 to $2.4 million. Generally 30%, 30 to 40% of the cost of the system, depending on where the systems are installed and the amount of U.S. materials that are procured for those assets. So if we're able to get those tax credits, we can reduce the cost that Ava spends, the net cost. But as noted before, the tax credit is at risk. Next slide, please. So as we think about our PPA pricing approach, we would plan to develop an Ava PPA price based on the costs of developing and operating these assets. And these are 25-year assets, so those operating costs are really important. They include equipment replacement costs, as well as administration of, and management of operations and maintenance of a contractor. And then we would look at kind of the base case city savings using that PPA rate. We'll be looking at the risks that could impact the costs and savings. So certainly the federal investment tax credit and the ability of Ava to directly take the ITC, which is was passed in the Inflation Reduction Act, is at risk. Tariffs, we've already seen tariffs go, from an additional 10% on China imports and then another 10%. So that's gone up by 20% since we were looking at this, prior to the election. And then the net metering 2.0 timeline. So what are the risks that impact, the cost to Ava to develop these assets and or the savings to the cities? We're thinking about, what would be the risk sharing approach? So if the costs go up or the savings go down, then how do we share that with the cities? And how do we get to an agreement there so that there's a cost sharing mechanism that both parties understand the risks and understand what happens and under what conditions either the PPA rate goes down or the savings go down for the cities. And then we look to basically create a set of reserve funds that we would have to allocate from local development funding, so that we can maintain city savings to the tune that we have agreed upon with cities, and then an ongoing operations. How do we make sure that we've reserved appropriately for operating these assets? So those are all things that we're working on right now from a PPA pricing perspective. So if we go to the next slide. So over the next month, really, we're going to be getting our RFQ or responses to our request for qualifications, and then issuing the RFP to those selected vendors so that we can confirm pricing and schedule from the contractor responses. So that will be happening kind of through March and into April to really getting a level of confidence in their ability to respond and develop these assets. We have to confirm what's our process, what are we gonna, how are we gonna manage the risk of owning and operating these assets, these solar projects, and develop our PPA price under those scenarios. We will be coming back to the board to allocate some funds for reserve funding for both incentives and operational costs, and that will incorporate some of these downside risk scenarios of not making them 2.0 and or losing some of the federal tax credits that are currently incorporated into the pricing. And then we're also looking at how potentially, we can install systems under net metering 3.0. So the systems that we have designed right now have really been designed for NEM 2.0. And under NEM 3.0, you'd really take a different design philosophy, which is how do you minimize export, which likely means reducing the size of the system so that you can maximize savings. And so we've started to take that approach with some of the systems that we have prioritized to say, well, if you redesign the system with really NEM 3.0 in mind, is there still a way to deliver savings? And then at what point in time do you actually make that design change? But first we have to evaluate, like, could we deliver savings under NEM 3.0 or systems under NEM 3.0 that can still deliver savings?
If I is that it from your end, before we open it up for clarifying questions and discussion, maybe I'll just add in a few elements here. Obviously, this is an informational item. We've surfaced this topic with the board already and wanted to continue to engage with the executive committee to make sure that we're providing the latest status, and we will certainly continue as meaningful updates are provided. I don't know that we'll expect to bring something forward to the full board in March. We probably won't. There probably won't be any meaningful changes from now. This big update is just to inform the board of we've initiated this process, this public works process for design build, starting with the RFQ. And so it will probably be the next executive committee meeting that we bring forward a meaningful update, and then maybe as early as April or May full board for some actual action items to move forward. Just wanted to share kind of where we're at in terms of sizing on this portfolio and really highlighting the risks that we're talking about here, order of magnitude wise. And I'll just reinforce the fact that the prior situation was a back-to-back PPA. So we had an agreed to power purchase agreement price and contract with our cities, and then we back-to-back that with the developer. So we sat in the middle and we tried to minimize any risk or gaps between those contracts to have a third-party entity own, operate, deliver on those projects and the energy to our city members. Now we're talking about Avis in it. So there's no backstop to us and us owning these assets, putting them on a balance sheet, and also still signing a PPA, at least anticipating that we'll sign in largely the same form that we've already agreed to with the cities. So we sit behind that. How we set that price, there's a lot of different parameters that we need to work through that JP highlighted in terms of what is our cost of capital, what is the O&M expense, we will need to replace the inverters on these systems midway through the life. What is the cost of that, bringing out a vendor at that stage, and how do you make sure you're properly accounting for that? So that will go into a pricing exercise, and we'll create a base case for our board to understand how do you quantify the expected savings and the expected risk. And then of course, we'll show you all the different risk factors around, well, what if you don't, is the base case even assuming that you get the investment tax credit? And then what if you lose that investment tax credit? Does it assume a certain level of tariffs? And what if those increase? Does it assume NEM 2.0, but maybe half the portfolio flips into NEM 3.0? So we'll show those types of risk factors to try to show an order of magnitude of, is this a $1, $2, $3, $4 million risk that AVA has, of course. And that's what we want to at least start to put in front of this board to make sure we understand, is this in the realm of reasonable? And should we continue down this path to continue to refine those numbers and see if this is something that we want to ultimately move forward with? So that's just kind of what sits ahead. And obviously we want to continue that dialogue with the board now on it. The other thing I'll just note, which we didn't really highlight here, is there are some other intangible benefits of moving forward with this. Just in the category of owning assets. We have always historically been in a balance sheet light entity. That's generally the CCA model. And we, similar to other CCAs, are considering owning assets. And that could be a whole slew of assets that are local, behind the meter, distributed energy resources, or it could be large wholesale assets that are multi-$100 million assets. We're obviously in the strategic planning phase of those things. So doing something like this does have some benefits, where we can start dabbling and putting some assets on the balance sheet, thinking about what it means to do asset management, to do reserving against this risk, seeing if ITC or direct pay, which is an ability for a tax exempt entity to receive a tax incentive, if those things play out. I'm not suggesting we should do it for this purpose. We should evaluate the risk and consider if we're comfortable with it relative to the benefits that it brings our member cities and our agency. But of course, those are some additional benefits that they just want to raise. Of strategically, I believe that our agency will own or should own assets. How we go about that obviously would be a little differently than this scenario, probably in a well thought through, well-timed manner. But in light of these circumstances, there are some of those additional benefits I just wanted to highlight. I'll stop there.
Okay. I'm sure this body has many questions. So we can kind of take turns maybe. I'm actually gonna go ahead and point of privilege, ask the first question because I just wanted to clarify something in terms of risk, scope of risk. I did hear a murmuring somewhere that actually NEM 2.0 itself might be revisited by the state of California in terms of the time horizon of it and shortening that time horizon. So I'm just curious if that is one of the risks we're going to be analyzing.
Yeah, there has been some discussions about that, you know, at the PUC and in Sacramento. And so I think that's something that we should add. You know, I think the risk matrix is kind of what's your probability and risk, right? And so we can give what we think about that. Of course, there's no crystal ball on what the impact of that is, but you know, we've done the assessment of, you know, of these sites at these prices. What's the NEM 2 savings and what's the NEM 3 savings? And so that NEM 3 savings effectively gives you your risk of if NEM 2 goes away. It'll be between, you know, depending on if it's in year 0 or year 24, right? Like that gives you at least the boundaries of the financial impact of NEM 2.0 sometime in that process.
Yeah, and I'll just add, affordability is top of mind for everyone right now, and in particular in the legislative session. And NEM is one of those topics that's definitely getting a lot of attention. It has been for years now, and it continues to in light of the affordability challenges and some of the cost shift aspects of what NEM does. And there is talk, it's very hard to predict where that will go. We know it's a somewhat divisive topic and has strong opinions on both sides. And there are a variety of approaches to that, some of which say, all right, you know, NEM 2 is only going to get a certain number of years to get that net export credit rate, and then it will flip to a different structure. And that number of years certainly can be debated in a lot of different scenarios there. There's also some discussion about a proposal that actually sets what the export rate will be at the time that your project comes online and holds it at that level. So that's another factor to take into account. So it's really hard to see what will happen there. I think what JP pointed out is there's the kind of the bookends of what it could be, and based off what could happen legislatively, it could be something, you know, in between there. This is just my guess is I don't think it's going to be an extreme retroactive change on NEM 2.0. I think all of the discussion that I've heard is that would hurt the trust that is in place between, you know, solar system owners and, you know, and the policies. And so I think it would be something more on the minor side of those savings impact if we're able to get it on time for the NEM 2.0 compliance.
So right now, if you know, you install, you get 20 years of NEM 2 from that time frame. So I think, you know, does that turn into 15, 10, 5 versus a retroactive wiping away of that current clause?
Okay, appreciate that perspective. Okay, I'm sure it looks like member Roche has her hand up virtually.
Thank you. I just wanted to ask, so why, again, I mean, maybe I missed this, but why did Greenbridge pause? You know, if they found it, they couldn't do this by April 26th, or maybe just remind me why they paused.
Yeah, I think there's a considerable amount of kind of federal uncertainty that's being introduced with respect to tariffs and ITC, and that and they also were concerned with their ability to get all of the projects interconnected by April of 2026, and kind of signing on to that en masse with significant damages for missing, you know, any one of those projects was something that they became unwilling to sign up for. And so, with our approach, we have, we're downsizing the portfolio, and also we have a little more flexibility as to when we pull a particular project out, whereas in the contract with them, they had to sign on to the whole contract for all 21 sites, and really commit to that.
So there
And I
wasn't, I
just-
mean, because you've now, like you were saying, we're gonna go down to 12 projects, I think. And so then why wouldn't we just pivot really quickly with them and say, okay, we understand, we can't do that either. Why aren't we just doing, why
Yeah.
isn't the project with them at 12?
Yeah, so they were, they, at the same time that they were having concerns about getting all the projects installed, they also had some kind of minimum volume requirements that they weren't interested in doing this unless it was 5 megawatts of project. So we were caught between too
Okay.
big, too small a little bit, because, downsizing it, and we asked them about this, could we contain it a little bit more and go with a smaller volume, smaller number of projects. But financing entities like this, they want a sufficient amount of volume to validate all the kind of the fixed costs that go into financing a portfolio like this.
And I'll just
Okay.
add as a reminder, when we first went out to market with this portfolio, it was a smaller portfolio and we didn't get qualified bids ultimately. We enlarged the portfolio size, went back out to market, and we had Greenbridge as the respondent that we had selected in that process. So it required that scale, that's pretty typical. I've kind of referenced this as a really hard segment to deliver on because they're too small to really give you good scale and economics. But they're not residential either, so they carry some complexity and weight to them. And so it's a hard segment in general. And there's a lot of fixed fees with attorneys' costs. And if you're bringing in ITC, in particular, the investment tax credit, there's a lot of fixed fees associated with working with a tax equity provider who generally is very picky about what they go fund. And they only want to go fund things that have a minimum size. So as this thing has
Okay.
compressed, the provider has stepped back from that as a result.
Thanks, that's really helpful. And then, yeah, so I think you said you're talking to city staff, right? Because I assume like every city, we're all in like slight budget crisis and especially concerned about what's coming down, with federal grants and contracts. So you'll go back and talk to the cities that if they're taking on more liability now and potentially more costs, then then I just wonder what will, we obviously need to get, confirmation from the cities that they're gonna want to go ahead, given the new lay of the land.
Yeah, we fully expect that, part of this process will be agreeing on the sites, the smaller portfolio with the cities, and then, city staff will have to bring back to, your bodies some approval process on that reduced portfolio, which also is likely to have reduced costs associated with it because it's just a smaller portfolio, so less dollars.
Okay.
But we would come back to Hayward and say it's these two projects, this is the expected savings, and and again, there's some level of cost sharing because of the increased risk, but there will still be, under the procurement rules, some level of cost savings to the city. So that will be what we would be discussing with staff first, and then bring back through staff to city council for approval.
Okay, and then my final question is, you said that it has to be connected by April 15, 2026. If the project is on its way, obviously sort of like getting there and getting connected, is there going to be any wiggle room, or is this it has to be connected by this date?
So we've asked PG&E about kind of an extension today. They're unwilling, unable to provide any kind of a blanket extension for all of our projects. That was something that we were pushing on prior to last meeting, and we can't get there. If there's a project and it's 98% of the way there and we just need an extra week or two, you can rest assured we're going to be pushing really hard to try to get an extension from PG&E, and they've said, yes, you can come back to us on a one-off basis, but we weren't able to get any kind of a blanket extension, which is what we would have needed to kind of keep this original process moving.
Okay, thank you.
Can I make a comment to just on this sort of gonna be talking about the risk a little bit. So in the original contract, the bulk of the risk was really all borne by the counterparty. And that was very intentional with how we set it up. That's how we went out to market. It was, we thought it was generally agreed to, but obviously there was risk in this portfolio to execute on as a, in a normal situation. And obviously with all of the uncertainty that we've been talking about, that increased risk put them over the edge of saying, we can't move forward on this. Now we're talking about without that counterparty, unfortunately, we're sitting there. And, you know, by owning the assets, technically we have some greater upside, but we also have a lot more downside here. Unfortunately, we're here because we're talking more about risks and uncertainty than there is really upside. With the cities, I think the premise here is that we're going to come up with a base case scenario, and we know there's a lot of uncertainties and risk factors that we'll also lay out with that. But with that base case, we'll project a savings level. And I expect that savings is probably going to be meager, lower than it was before. And, you know, making up a number, maybe it's 5% savings. And then there's going to be the various risk elements. Ava will be in a situation where we will likely need to bear the bulk of that risk. And I think the setup may be, all right, we're going to project it's a 5% savings under the base case. And if things go wrong, we don't get the ITC tariffs increase or whatever else it may be, your savings will probably go to 1%. We have to keep it about zero just for net neutrality to even allow them to move forward. So there's not a lot of room that they can bear that risk. And the rest will be Ava. And so that's just something that's maybe the biggest aspect to share here, which is the risk will be largely borne by Ava. And unfortunately, there's more downside risk than there is upside risk. It's just wow, perform and everything like that. So that's probably the biggest piece that we'll need to quantify for you to ultimately opine on and approve. But that's the part that we most want to socialize here for continued discussion. Say, are we heading in the right direction? And are we comfortable with this order of magnitude risk if we're bearing really the lion's share of that? But it is for our cities, of course, to ultimately deliver these systems that do carry resilience and help, help our cities meet their climate action goals and such.
All right, thanks. That's all I had. Thank you.
Thank you. Any other questions from my colleagues?
I'll just mention that I talked with staff before this about this. So the update related to PG not granting the extension, though, that's new and unfortunate, but no questions.
Thank you. Vice Chair.
So just curious about trying to understand our risk and motivations and all that kind of stuff. If right now the environment is a high price environment, maybe I should ask, is right now considered a high price environment? Price for power?
I think right now it's considered a very uncertain environment. 2 months ago, it was not considered a high risk environment. It's just, it was a stable-ish environment. Now it's an uncertain environment, and it's so fresh that counterparties haven't even reacted to this for the most part. We just happen to be in a situation where we're looking to sign something imminently, where everything else will have probably play out a little bit more. And without the NEM 2.0 deadline, we'd probably just sit on this and say, let's let things play out and have more certainty on where this is going to head before we decide to move forward. But that's what creates the clock for us.
So I'm just going to try to play through the risks so that I understand it. Suppose that right now is a high price environment, that gas is expensive, it's a marginal price is high. That means that our contract with the city would be at a high price?
No, not necessarily. So the pricing with the city is really independent from gas prices.
I'm going to pause for just a second, because what I really care about is if the price in the market were to change and become super cheap, they're giving away gas. Does that matter to us in terms of this contract and whether we're losing or making money?
Technically, we are not exposed to that. And so I think what we're saying is there's the cost of the solar installation, and therefore that translates to a solar PPA. That's independent. So we lock that in, fix it. What you're, I think, pointing to is what are market energy prices and where are our rates? And in the scenario where gas prices plummet, our rates go down because power prices in California go down. Therefore, the system is not actually providing significant savings. It may be a loss to our cities relative to the PPA.
That sits on the cities.
That sits on the city. So that's not risk we're absorbing. And there was no scenario where we were absorbing that.
Yeah, but what, and if the price changes, again, goes really high up, they get the savings. So we're neutral in all of that. We have no price risk.
Not to the volatility of energy price changes. What we have modeled is a utility cost escalator into the city savings number, and we did that based on a fairly conservative forecast, considering price increases, unfortunately, that we've seen, especially over the last year, mostly on the transmission and distribution side because of wildfires and utility hardening. So we've seen a lot of increases on that side of the bill. And so, you know, those increases or an increasing utility bill environment presents more savings for the cities over time, but that doesn't present that we're indifferent to that.
And the main reason that I ask is that right now, one of the things that came out of our meetings with two representatives and two assembly members and two senators was that there's a lot of energy in Sacramento around electricity prices. So I'm trying to think through, does that matter to us? I think it's just it matters to the cities in terms of the savings that they might or might not experience, but to us, it doesn't matter.
Yeah, because we aren't guaranteed, our power purchase agreement does not guarantee savings. It doesn't float with the city's electricity bills.
Just on panels, solar panel risk. Are there American manufacturers and are they 10%, 20%, 50% more expensive? Like, at what point there's a tariff, it doesn't matter anymore because there's other suppliers.
So there are some American solar panel manufacturers. They are more expensive than 10% or so. They've largely been the ones who have argued that tariffs on foreign modules, solar modules, should be in place. The new tariff environment is just writ large on all imports, right? So not specific to energy. And so previously there was a lot of focus on solar module tariffs from China for dumping. And so a lot of the large manufacturers have diversified the country of origin for their modules. So the solar modules are one key part of the equipment that our vendors and contractors we've talked to have alternate sources that are not from China that are less subject to Chinese tariffs. But if there's a global trade war, there's a risk there. Modules and inverters, batteries and inverters are more limited from a manufacturing perspective. More of them tend to come from China. So we've been modeling the tariff impacts across the different equipment supply, and it's something that we have in our cost models around those different tariff impacts. There are some manufacturers in the US, and we're certainly going to be evaluating using those, but that doesn't mitigate the cost impacts.
I think my last question really focuses on, it's a super open-ended question, but is this even realistic? Is it realistic to get this stuff done by April 15th? Primarily in the context of, I've seen how long construction projects take in my city.
Yeah.
We were just convincing a little bit about the mayor's construction contract challenges. And I hear that a lot from elected officials. Things just take a long time. We can squeeze on permitting on our end as individual cities. But I want to make sure that we want so much to do this that we're gonna do it. And if we choose for strategic reasons, we're gonna invest $6 million. We're gonna do something, then let's make that decision. But I wouldn't want to go into something where we really don't think that we can meet the NEM 2.0 deadline, but we're just trying to push it through. I just want to be transparent about how it is that we're really thinking about this.
I think that makes sense, and my response to you would just be, as we actually quantify some of these risks, I think we want to be very realistic about what the base case is and what we're approving, which is whether it's base case and we feel really good about it, or it's base case and downside is what we're really asking for approval on, so we're really comfortable with that scenario, and only in that scenario should we move forward. And if we don't like that scenario at all, and we're just gonna assume that happens, then that would not be the right way to sort of present this and speak to that risk. So we'll be sure to really talk about those risk factors, what the risk, what the base case is, and what the downside truly is. And I think we'll be in a much better position when we bring this ultimately to the board for action, because we will have proposals from the EPCs that speak to how comfortable they are in taking on some of that risk. That's, that's where you really get to, how real this is.
I mean, things can be built very quickly. They can be. I just don't see it often happening.
Yeah, and like solar, and we were already planning to separate out the solar installation from the storage installation. That's already going into this. It's like a throw everything at it to potentially speed it up. And the solar projects themselves, it's not an overly complicated installation. And so like just the construction part that's the short part, right? It's the contracting, it's the permitting, it's the inspection, it's getting all the materials in an environment where the supply chain might start to get constrained. And so that's where all these other factors play in, and the complexity around, all the trade implications and customs implications, just like one more straw on the camel's back, of how confident are we? And so to Howard's point, we felt like based on the work that was done, it made sense to go and talk to the contractors who would do this work, and gauge their level of ability and confidence in that schedule. And part of that's going to be signing up for some level of damages to share that risk if they aren't able to meet that deadline. And then we can come back to you and say, we went out and talked to 10 and only one says they can do it and everyone else is wildly on the other side, right? Then
Matt can
Yes.
this information.
Yeah, totally. Okay, so I had one last question, and maybe it's premature, but if, let's say, all of this does move forward and we are in the position to be owning assets, does this mean that we have to staff ourselves slightly differently as an agency? Are we gonna have to create a department to then oversee these assets, or what is the vision there? We don't have to spend too much time on
Yeah.
it because it's a hypothetical.
The short is, yes, we have to account for actual asset ownership.
Yeah.
And what it takes to actually oversee
Right.
vendors, contracts, risk associated with getting on site and doing repairs, things of that sort. How much staff is
Right.
subject to discussion, what kind of assets, of course.
Okay, well, if this goes forward, that would be just something for the board to understand.
Yeah, and I will certainly take the opportunity to mention that, Rusty Mills, our new CFO, came from SMUD, and they have certainly done a lot of work on asset ownership, and he'd saw the financial evaluation of owning versus outsourcing, so that's
Yeah,
part
it's a
of.
trade-off, and
Yeah.
you've got so many of those things, property insurance, liability, things like that. Certainly highlighting the ITC, and that, we're not gonna know for a year and a half from, COD to whether you can get it, so that risk is on the table, you won't really know if that part of the equation actually works out in your favor or not, so you kinda gotta just go in knowing that that's a risk that might not be there, so there's
Could you explain that acronym to us?
the ITC, the investment tax credit. So that's the, part of the IRA.
Right.
That allowed us to actually participate in the tax equity arrangement that developers have enjoyed. So the way it works is you put a asset into service, and then the following year is when you file for those tax credits. So it takes a while.
There's a built-in lag time.
Yeah.
So if we deliver these in April, if that goes according to plan, we're not actually filing for the incentive until 2027.
But 26.
Well,
If they
they-
go into operation in 25, we can file. in
Right, but they're going
26.
in operation in 26.
Oh, they're going in operation
Right,
26,
next
so
year,
27.
26. So it's not until 27 that you're actually.
So the tax credit
Applied
would have
for the
to
incentive.
still be around in 20.
Right.
Okay, all right.
Yeah.
Okay, unless there's any other questions at this time, I'm gonna go ahead and ask for, if we have any public comment on this item, number 4.
Yes. Bradley Cleveland. Recognized for 3 minutes.
Yes, thank you.
Okay, there. My name is Bradley Cleveland. I'm an Oakland resident and a consultant with the Electrical Workers Union, IBEW Local 595, and our partners, NorCal NECA, the Electric Contractors Association. I just want to say I really appreciate the work of staff to try to address this challenge of modifying this program at this late stage. I do want to remind the board why AVA is developing these resilience centers. And that is, we have this challenge of climate change and more extreme weather, the kind of emergencies we're facing, power outages, earthquakes, wildfires, smoke emergencies, heat, extreme heat. So there is a risk to doing nothing to mitigate the risks facing our communities. Now, the problem is it's hard to quantify the risks that communities face, but there is a real financial risk facing our communities not building these resilience centers. And I also just want to finish by saying that while the time frame is getting really tight, we are confident there will be interest among some of the local signatory contractors in this project moving forward, and they will be able to bring this project in on time. Thank you.
Great, thank you for those comments. Do you have any other public speakers?
There are no further hands raised at this time.
Okay, great. I do think that is a good point to think about how we can quantify, because I'm not sure, to the speaker's point, we can't quantify the risk of not being able to pursue this. So I do appreciate that perspective, and I do think that's one we should keep in mind, although again, it's hard to quantify. Okay, any other thoughts or comments, suggestions at this time? Staff, do you have what you need from us at this time? Yeah, thank you. Okay, great. Thank you so much. We're going to go ahead and close agenda item number 4 and move on to agenda item number 5, which is local development business fund review. This is also an informational item. And I'm looking at
Annie is going to take this
Okay, Annie, thank you so much.
Good afternoon, and apologies to those online because I know the camera is behind me. I will turn back around during questions. So this is the local development fund reconciliation, different than the local development business plan. But a lot of the work that had initially been proposed under that plan does get executed by the local development team. And so I want to start off with how I approached looking at this. Essentially, year over year, since fiscal year 20, our board has approved an allocation of funds to the local development fund, and that is very different than other parts of the agency. The local development fund itself does not, if it is unspent in 1 year, it will roll over to the next year. That is not true of things like marketing, for example. If it's not spent in that year, that budget kind of gets a clean slate. So we started this approach in, as I said, fiscal year 20. In FY 18 and 19, there was minimal contributions to the local development fund. We were really just trying to get off the ground with our start of service. And it did not have that same accounting treatment of rolling over. It was just, if it wasn't spent, it went away. So we're looking now at a budget time frame of fiscal year 20 through fiscal year 25 is the end date. For the expenses, they start July 2019, which is the start of fiscal year 20, because we go 19, 20 in our fiscal years. And it's through September of 2024. So it's not completely up to date, but it took a lot to sort of process through this information. And so we're close, but not totally up to today or even the end of the year. And I've really focused on looking at the budget, actual expenses through September 2024, and then anticipated spending. So things that are quote unquote earmarked, because when these budgets have been presented over the years, we are rather specific in where that money is intended to be spent. So what I'm trying to do here is say, this is where we intended, here's sort of where we are now and how it aligns with our current strategy and prioritization. I do also want to note, these are not audited financials. This is really meant to be sort of directional to give a high level understanding of what's happening within the fund. And I will say, oh, can we go to the next slide, Adrian? I have to remind myself as I'm doing it here. So there are some spent or quote unquote earmarked funds that will eventually be reimbursed, not all the earmarks, but some of them. And that is because they're coming from grant funding from the PUC or perhaps their loans that we've issued. So some examples of that is the Disadvantaged Community Green Tariff or DAC-GT. That is reimbursable by the PUC, but does show up here as just under $1 million in expenses. Similarly, the Building Efficiency Accelerator, which just recently the board allocated $1 million of our funds, but everything else, it's about $5.5 million is reimbursable funds. So that shows up currently as an expense of around 1.1 million. For our loans, we had an initial pilot program with Block Power where we loaned and they are actively paying that back. We have this medium heavy duty electrification for drayage trucks. It's a loan that we've committed to, but we actually haven't issued or spent them, handed out that money yet. But when the time comes, we expect to get that money back. And then lastly, the beneficial municipal electrification loan is the City of Piedmont Electric Pool for $1 million, which they'll start repaying in the next calendar year. So I'm not accounting for those things coming back to us right now. I'm just saying they are earmarked or spent. So here is, next slide, please. Here is a view from the time when we started this local development fund up until our most current budget approval. I lumped it into these main categories. This is generally how we framework our thinking around local development. I do have a future slide that talks more specifically about some of the cost centers, but you have your transportation, electrification, building electrification, resilience, grants, and other. I will note that that other is legal, marketing, sponsorships and memberships, and some administrative costs. We have not been consistent in our treatment of whether marketing dollars for a specific program are pulled from the local development fund or whether those go into a marketing budget, which year over year cycles through. We will be looking to be more consistent with that going forward. But as you can see, it's a much smaller amount compared to the other focus areas. I also want to note a little bit of foreshadowing. Under resilience, this does not include any surplus budget allocations, which we have done just once in our history so far, and I'll bring that back up later. We could go to the next slide, please. So this is not all of the itemized budget allocations, but these are anything over $2 million, just to give you a sense of where this money is. I won't read through it, but I will summarize by saying this represents nearly 74 million of the 89.5 million, or about 83% of the budget is shown within these budget centers. The other things are all below $2 million as individual line items, and those are things like workforce training, energy efficiency, some managed charging, and we'll come back. You'll see some of those end up getting bumped up in what I'm calling our updated budget. So next slide, please. This is a year over year view. You can see that the totals sum in the same way. This was really just to share some visibility because when we look at the updated, you'll see the year over year totals are the same. So we didn't change anything there, but we might have found that a pilot that we allocated X amount of dollars to, we decided not to move forward with, or we had remaining funds. So how did we reallocate or rethink that money? Next slide, please. So why an updated budget? I sort of just mentioned some of that, but over time, some of our initially proposed budget areas shifted in some ways. So perhaps we achieved savings through efficient execution. So those are things like I just mentioned. Well, no, not so much the pilot, but maybe it just didn't cost as much as we thought it would. Maybe that was technical assistance. Some things did not go beyond the pilot project. Those are things like Block Power, for example. Maybe they weren't relevant or necessary due to regulatory policy changes. For example, we allocated funds to what we were calling community solar. That ended up being a CPUC program that eventually got rolled into the disadvantaged community green tariff. So with that policy change and the reimbursement from PUC, we no longer needed to pay for that out of our own budget. Some transitioned to other departments. So that might have been something like we had indicated NEM enhancements where we wanted to give additional surplus credit to care customers. That doesn't actually show up as a budget expense. It ends up being a reduction in revenue received from those customers. So that budget just doesn't really show up in our local development fund, as an example. Some things were better allocated to a different category within the local development fund. For example, we had indicated municipal electrification. We've assigned that to critical municipal facilities. So very similar, but we just did not call it specifically CMF, so we moved that over. Some were consolidated, we just brought it together. Some ended up not being an execution priority, and later in the presentation, you'll see what I'm calling sort of funds that we don't actively have plans for those areas, and so we will be contemplating, how to reassign that budget. And then, of course, an updated budget is going to reflect the additional budget assigned as part of a surplus budget allocation. And again, this is intended to identify and report changes between the original of what we presented to the board and our current strategy and priorities. So we can go to the next slide, please. So this is cumulative, not year over year, but showing what the original budget was for the category and then what the updated is, and then the differential. The big standout here, of course, is it ended up being $14.9 million from the budget surplus of last fiscal year, which is going to the upfront incentives for our solar and storage program. And that covers residential, care and FARA, increased incentives, and our resilience hubs. The other most notable change is a reduction from building electrification into grants. And the largest portion of that, which I'll go over, was what we called workforce training. Under building electrification, we moved into grants that support workforce development. And we can go to the next slide. So here I detailed out sort of how that money moved from one to the other. Some of these I've already noted. I will call out for the grants in addition to that 1.65 million for building electrification under workforce training. We also allocated funds to our COVID grants that we did in 2020. And so you can see where those funds were moved from things like an electrical showcase, which is basically an outreach and demonstration center. We weren't going to be doing that during COVID and a global pandemic, so we shifted the funds into ways that can immediately support the communities. And other things like I have AMP, that is the arrearage management program, and that is a financial assistance program. Otherwise, I think most of these are fairly straightforward and pointing out where we pulled money from and where we moved it into. Again, most of these are fairly closely aligned. And we can go to the next slide, Adrienne. So this is where our budget centers hit. Again, everything that is above $2 million, it's individual line items. In the total summary number here is just almost $91 million, and about 87% of that total, roughly $105 million, that has been allocated to the local development budget. So some things that appear that perhaps didn't appear previously: managed charging, which is our AVA smart home charging program that will be launching. The outreach will start beginning of April. That is now $6 million, and that is matched with $4 million from ACTC. Or I'm sorry, I'm conflating these things. That's Bike Electric. You're right. Sorry. So that is $6 million for managed charging. It's a multi-year program. Then we have AVA Bike Electric that did not appear before. That is the one where there's an additional $4 million from ACTC. to provide rebates both for kind of market rate and for an elevated incentive for care and para customers across all of Alameda County and the city of Tracy. And we will be able to launch that to Stockton and Lathrop when they begin service. I think, and then healthy communities, I believe that might have been in our earlier cost centers, but that is $10 million. It's currently a pilot that we have board approval for $2 million. That started in October. We'll be running that for a year and then doing an assessment and coming back to the board with our recommendation of how to move forward. But because we had initially said $10 million, I kept it sort of allocated there. But there are, of course, assessments we will make. So I think I will move forward from here. If we could go to the next slide, please, Adrienne. So this is just what it looks like year over year as we do the updated budget. And then on the next slide, please. As I mentioned before, there's a handful of things that we had initially put into our budget presentation to the board and was approved that now we're not currently planning to deploy. So some things might be like Muni Fleet charging as a service. This is essentially, we would, similar to Ava Charge, our DC fast charging program, rather than being public, we would develop the fast charging infrastructure for a city, and then they would basically pay a subscription to charge their fleets. We pursued this. We had some interest, honestly, because a lot of funding to support the conversion of their fleets has gone away. There is no longer an interest in this. Therefore, it's sort of tagged as, we don't currently have a plan for the use of this money, but you can see the areas it lives within: the transportation electrification and building electrification. So I'll move along. And so here's a comparison between the original and updated, where I've now brought in the expenses through September 2024, as well as those earmarked funds, those things that we haven't spent it yet, but we intend to. So like that 14 million for solar plus storage, we intend to spend that, so we earmarked it. So we've spent just over $17.5 million through September of last year, and we've earmarked around 77 million. I'll show you more on that in the next slide. But what that ends, and we had a bit of overspending in the other column that was largely our legal spending. Turns out that launching DC fast chargers and creating our own PPAs and such, those cost money with lawyers. So in the end, there's about $9.5 million that we're saying we can apply that in different ways under transportation and building electrification. So the earmarked funds, this is just to give you a sense of where those $77 million are earmarked and sort of the status. Oh, I'm sorry, thank you. The status of those various programs. So I think the big one here is our Ava Charge, our DC fast charging network. That initially was committed at $3 million a year for 10 years. So far that's, and then we've had some additional supporting funds as well. So right now we're at $13 million. Well, actually this 13 million is the earmarked plus whatever we spent so far equals the total budgeted amount. The other big center is the healthy communities. As I've mentioned, we're in a pilot phase and we'll be coming back to talk about our next steps analysis, probably end of the calendar year, because it'll only wrap at the end of October. Yeah. And then the other big cost center here is the upfront incentives for solar and storage, with then another $8+ million allocated under our grants for community workforce. So I went through this very quickly. Can we go one more slide, please? So wanted to share this with you and then note what our thinking was around this $9.5 million, is that we would be working, staff will be working, of course, on developing our draft budget, and then come back to the board as we do every year with multiple presentations of that budget. And at that time, we would present a proposal or recommendation on how to allocate the roughly $9.5 million. And in addition, just as a side note, sort of longer term local development road mapping is also something we're working on simultaneously. we're definitely very heads down focused on execution because we have a lot of programs recently launched, soon to be launched. It's a lot of work. And then we have fun pivots where we're suddenly going to own assets. So we have a lot of things to do. And then once those programs are up and running, a lot of them are multi-year operational programs, but we are starting to think about that 2027 and beyond timeframe.
One thing I'll also just mention from sort of a policy perspective is, for a little bit of history, early on, we didn't, as Andy mentioned, first year or two, we didn't have a separate local development fund. I think there was a lot of concern just around, what is the stability of this? It's an important priority area. And because it's hard to spend that money, as you're seeing, you earmark it, but these programs are really long programs. Some of it is to cover risk, some of that is actually spent over 10 years. So you're sitting there with a lot there still that is unspent. And so we did this as a way to make sure we're managing and accounting for that, given the high visibility of local development activities and funds. And to ensure that if we do decide that, this is a lower priority program, we didn't just say we'll put those funds back in the general fund, but make sure we maintain those for transparency and visibility sake for our board and our community. So this is still going to go to some type of effort. And sure, every 5 years or so, we have to go back and do a reconciliation, talk about how things have actualized. So that was part of the intent and the history behind why we created a separate local development fund. With that said, there's not an explicit or formalized policy to say this is exactly how to treat this. This is not a reserve policy. I guess is my point. It's a little bit more loose than that, but really for our board's benefit to say these are funds that we're tracking separately than other funds. It doesn't carry any S&P credit rating aspects if you change the local development funding plan or anything. Whereas reserve policy, you want to be really careful about how you touch that, of course. So just wanted to differentiate that. The other thing I'll just note is this is more anecdotal. We haven't done maybe a rigorous benchmarking against other CCAs, but we've done a very good job of allocating towards local development fund. We put a lot of funding towards those areas. And we certainly want to think about as we go into the next planning phase, how much more we want to put on that year to year. And just think about what is the right way to both ensure that we're addressing affordability issues as well as continue to invest in local programs and such for our communities. So.
Thank you for that presentation. Really appreciate the reconciliation and the thought process behind that. I'm just noting the time. We have about 10 minutes for questions and discussions before we need to wrap the meeting up. So go ahead and start with member Roche.
Thanks. Yeah, just really quick. Thank you, Annie, for that presentation. So you're saying you'll come back to us with the individual program updates because you went through them quickly, but you were just trying to give us an overall budget update on this sort of accounting for all these programs together. Is that right?
Correct. It's trying to give you a sense of what have we budgeted to the local development fund? What were those sort of budget centers? What have we spent and sort of what is left to be programmed?
All right, thanks. So then then thank you for the presentation because then it did sort of spur some questions about individual programs, but I'll wait till those come to us for updates. Thank you.
Okay.
Okay, great. Thank you. Chair Balch.
Yeah, so staff, as I thought about this and I think about the extent and breadth of it, I guess one of the questions, and I know we are thinking about it, but I just want to make sure I ask, is the efficiency of actually deploying the dollars versus the administrative cost. I mean, when we're doing pilots, it's super hard, right? We don't know what we got to do. We don't know the barriers we're going to face. I keep thinking of the electrification of the stoves, and we walk into any home and it's none are the same, right? They're all very customized, right? But then it makes it difficult to if we were a nonprofit, you'd be like, well, how much is administrative versus how much is achieving the mission? So can you, with the short time we've got, can you just kind of give me some comfort that we're really cognizant of that and trying to be aware of getting the dollars deployed, right? Getting the mission done versus administrative.
Yeah, I think, there's two layers, I think, of administrative costs. We have our internal staff and then, a lot of this work is done through external vendors. And so in our approach to bringing on vendors, we're always going to be very cognizant of, establishing kind of administrative cost cap in those contracts. So we have visibility towards how those dollars are gonna be deployed for actual customer benefits versus, paying contractors to do that work for us. And so we have that more, I would say, at a quantitative level through the contracts that we have, and then, we have our burden of our administrative costs on, on top of that for staff that Ava employs ourselves.
Yeah,
And I would,
oh,
sorry, I was just gonna say, I think a lot of the work that has been done, I wouldn't call it administrative, but it doesn't sort of show up in the world in the same way yet. So an example is Ava Charge, which we do have one site with 34 ports here in Oakland that is up and running and available to the public. The work that that it took for that and the pipeline of other sites that we needed the site licensing agreements with all of the cities, which we have a total of how many sites? 6?
Yeah, well, there's 17
A
sites
lot.
under development and about 150 that we have kind of site control for.
Site control, that we had the tolling agreement, so those are our development partners, and we have 2 of them, and that is a new structure, a novel agreement structure that has not been used in the market before. And then we had all the PG&E interconnection applications, because you need to make sure you have enough power at the site. So all of this pre-development work has been done, is being done, and it's not quite as visible and flashy as like a ribbon cutting at our first station or the network launch, but it is essential to getting these things out and available to our customers.
Can I also just add on, maybe comment on a slightly different way, which is, I think maybe what you're asking is also what is the cost effectiveness of these programs to a certain extent? And so that is a huge factor for what we want to do here. And I'll just maybe point to, on one of the slides, it talks about what we've actually spent and what's earmarked. We have over $100 million budgeted. We've actually only spent about $18 million.
Right.
So there's a lot of money to be spent. And part of that money is to reserve against risk. So our DC fast charging portfolio, as an example, we hope to actually be scalable and be self-sufficient on its own, even though we've actually earmarked, $10 to $15 million towards that program. We hope we don't need to use any of it. And we may be coming back in another 5 years saying that program is going really well, and we don't actually need to utilize any of those funds, and so they're reserving it. So there's different flavors of how this money is actually allocated. But ultimately, your point on like cost effectiveness, we do want to ensure cost effectiveness. We don't want to spend half the money and then only have half of the money actually accruing to our communities and our customers. We want the bulk of that money accruing to them, whether that be in the form of incentives or programs or services, whatever it may be. And I think as we're looking at this sort of next phase of program design, we'll be really focused on what is really additive and of high value to our customers.
yeah, and thank you. I appreciate that, because one of the other things that I'm trying to think about is, take a completely different approach. If Ava wanted to be hands off, you could offer rebates or incentives or something like like we do a lawn rebate, put the entire obligation for the customization on the customer at their home, and then market the heck out of it. So, are your marketing dollars and the rebates you give more effective to get electrification, right? Versus something like we're saying with the chargers, which is a highly customized, each site is unique. It's an interesting challenge, I guess. I think, this is for a different thought line for the future, but, obviously how to advance it, right? So.
Yeah, I think, we have not put a lot of dollars into straight incentives. And I think the thinking there has been, there's just limited funds to give to an individual customer, and it's not really scalable. So we've been trying to think about some of these more innovative delivery models like Ava Charge or CMF, where we can build something that, is a little more innovative and complicated, but also can be scaled if we prove success. I think the reality is we need some kind of a balance there. And we are looking at some, programs like our bike electric program where, we're delivering incentives out, and, those are cost-effective dollars. There's a certain number of customers who are going to kind of win the lottery on that. And so, it's a little bit of a balance between those two approaches.
Yeah. And thank you, JP. And, as we look at expanding territory for Ava and, the reach, this is just the nuance of it, right? Is there a way, I can leave it for offline. Thank you. That concludes my comments, Chair.
Great, and if I may, I may have a question question, and I know the vice chair may have a question, but I want to turn right now to public comment in case any members of our public have a hard out at 4:30. Do we have any members of the public who want to comment on this agenda item?
There are no hands raised at this time.
Okay, I'm gonna go ahead and close public comment and turn back to the vice chair to see if there are any questions you'd like to try to address in the next 4 minutes.
Yeah, it should be really easy. We've spent 17.5. The remaining money, like, how is that accounted for? Is it sitting in its own separate reserve account or whatever, is it a separate fund on the ledger?
It is a separate fund on the ledger. It's not a separate bank account, but it is a separate fund. So from an accounting basis, we completely separated it.
I was excited about reimbursement. Do we have a sense of, are we talking about 5 million, 10 million, $25 million? Like what is the amount that's subject to reimbursement? Ballpark.
It is, right now, it's $1 million that has been issued. And then there's another $4.5 million that's been earmarked for the medium and heavy duty project. So it's $750K for the pool, about 300 for block power. Anyway, so it's about $1 million issued, another $4.5 million that will be issued at that once that project achieves COD.
And when you say, when you're using the term reimbursement, does that include loans and CPUC reimbursement?
No, that's just loans.
Okay, what about the reimbursement?
Some of the
Let
CPUC
me look.
reimbursement, aren't even in these numbers because they're actually funding, right?
Yeah,
That's what I look at. There's a
that's
little
five-
note at the top.
Yeah, so there's $5.5 million for DAC GT, or I'm sorry, for our Building Efficiency Accelerator, our energy efficiency program. And then DAC GT, I think was $1 million in the budget, but DAC GT is actually a larger expense.
So there's
So,
$5 to $8 million, that are not actually even accounted for here, that we're getting reimbursed through CPUC. Yeah.
Thank you, Chair.
Okay, and my question on this was not necessarily needing to be answered in the 3 minutes remaining. But I was just more curious about what the limiting factors are for deployment of these programs and these dollars. Are there staff constraints? Like, what are the constraints that the agency is facing? I'd like to better understand that, but that's not something I can answer right now. Okay, so we did public comment. Are we okay if we close this agenda item? The staff, do you have what you need from us on this?
Yep.
Okay, great. I'm gonna go ahead and close agenda item number 5. Agenda item number 6 is committee member and staff announcements, including requests to place items on future executive committee agendas. Do my colleagues have any matters they would like us to address in the future? Chair Walsh.
Just a quick note that we've moved these meetings from Member Gonzalez, but I will miss the next one because it conflicts and I haven't moved the calendar on my side. So for quorum, we just need to make sure we'll have it.
Thank
For
you very
April.
much for the heads up on that. Okay, any other items this time? Okay, seeing none, I'm gonna go ahead and move to agenda item number 7, and that is adjournment. And we are adjourning at 4:28.
Ahead of time.
Oh.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you
you.
so much, and thank you to staff.
Thank you for quorum.